In the early 2010s, the commercial viability of the Ace Combat franchise seemed to be at an all-time low. Ace Combat 6 had sold poorly due to Xbox exclusivity, Assault Horizon had turned a lot of longtime fans away from the franchise and failed to bring in a broader audience like Bandai Namco had hoped it would, and the handheld games after Ace Combat X didn't exactly sell amazingly either. So to test the waters and attempt to revive interest in the franchise, Project Aces got approval for a free-to-play Ace Combat game that would be filled with microtransactions and a live service business model, hoping that it would show their publisher that the franchise could still bring in enough money to be worth producing. And despite some low review scores, longtime AC fans enjoyed Ace Combat Infinity enough to keep playing it, and Bandai Namco brought in enough money from the product to be willing to approve a true sequel for the Ace Combat franchise once again. And 5 whole years later, fans would finally receive Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown in January of 2019. So would Ace Combat 7 be a proper revival of the franchise, or would it be yet another failed experiment from Project Aces? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 13th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown is a combat flight simulation game developed by Project Aces and published by Bandai Namco Games for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC in 2019. And when starting up the campaign, it quickly becomes clear that Ace Combat 7 has the best story presentation in the entire series. The game opens with a ton of lore being dumped on the player, much like most other Ace Combat games, but contrary to the majority of mainline AC games, this opening lore dump is actually easy to understand for a first-time player. Now, to be completely fair, that could be due to the fact that I've played every Ace Combat game up to this point, and a lot of this lore is referential to events and nations from previous games. But just speaking from my own experience with the games, this was the first time in my entire run of the series that I watched the opening cutscene and actually felt like I fully understood what was going on. The story opens with peace in the continent of Usea being disrupted for the first time in nearly a decade, a cheeky nod to the franchise's years of dormancy. Years of rising tensions between Osea and Erusea finally boil over when Erusea launches a surprise drone attack on Osea, capturing the majority of the Usean continent in the process. We play as Trigger, a member of the Osean Air Force's Mage Squadron, and we spend these early missions fighting to retake the continent from the Erusian forces. And as we get into the first mission of the campaign, I was immediately caught off guard by just how beautiful this game is. The plane models, the lighting, the weirdly high fidelity of the clouds, this game is just insanely pleasant to look at, and this is true from the first mission all the way through to the last. There are still some things that don't look all that great, like the terrain in some levels in particular looks pretty low quality, and there's an insane amount of pop-in present, but if you're just playing the game like normal and not paying super close attention to the finer details, you're unlikely to even notice these things. And aiding the presentation, as always, is the incredible soundtrack that Keiki Kobayashi composed for the game. It features a little bit of every sound from the Ace Combat series, even having a couple acoustic guitar-heavy tracks that are reminiscent of Zero, but it really leans heavily into the orchestral sound. And while a lot of Ace Combat games will have 1 or maybe 2 tracks with a choir worked into them, AC7's soundtrack heavily features choirs and vocals in general, something that you definitely won't hear me complaining about. Here, take a quick listen and see what you think. Also, during the first mission, longtime fans will be happy to discover that Ace Combat 7 plays pretty much identically to the PS2 games. It feels so similar to them, in fact, that I didn't even consciously notice anything for the first few minutes because a few hours earlier, I had actually been streaming Ace Combat 5, and going straight from that to starting up 7, it just felt completely natural. There's no crazy gimmicks here like DFM or evasive maneuvers, it's just good old-fashioned Ace Combat. And thanks to the 13 years of technological advancements between AC6 and 7, the controls feel smoother than they ever have before. Because of this, there's actually very little to talk about here in terms of the core gameplay mechanics, as it's all pretty much exactly what you'd expect from an Ace Combat game. That's not to say that there's nothing new to mention here in the gameplay, but we'll come back to that once we've covered the rest of the basics. And about the most basic thing that I could possibly bring up is that the menu and UI design in this game is really damn good. The menus are easy to read, they look nice, and they're incredibly easy to navigate as everything is placed exactly where you'd expect them to be. And my praise of the menus even extends to something that I never would have expected from a newer AC title, but I really like the briefing screens in this game. If you've seen my earlier videos in the series, you'll know that I adored the briefings in Air Combat and AC2, but ever since those very early titles, the briefings were simplified and had way less detail and personality to them, and I brought it up in every single video until I think Ace Combat 5, where I finally just gave up hope on them ever returning to their original form. And while I wouldn't say that Ace Combat 7 has a better briefing screen than Ace Combat 2, which absolutely reigns supreme to this day in that regard, these are some of the best and most detailed briefings the series has seen in a very long time, and I would say that they're definitely top 3 in the franchise as a whole. And since we're already in the menus, I think now would be a good time to talk about how Ace Combat 7 approaches its progression. Instead of unlocking planes in a linear order as you progress through missions like normal, AC7 instead introduces something totally new in the form of the aircraft tree. With this, you have a starting point where you're given your F-16 at the beginning, and from there, you can go down whatever path you choose, using the points you earn from completing missions to unlock whatever planes or upgrade parts you want in whatever order you want. And yeah, you heard me right, upgrade parts. The customizable part system from Access Games' handheld titles has finally made its way over to a mainline entry, and it's somehow even crazier here than it was in those games. In games like X and X2, you would have a few different part categories such as your wings or your armor plating, and you would be able to select one custom part for each of those categories. But here, there's a limit of 8 parts total, and you can use all those slots however you please. There are smaller limits, such as each plane having its own hard cap for things like how many movement-based parts or weapon-based parts you can add, but throughout my entire playthrough, I never actually hit any of these smaller limits, so even if you did, it would barely limit your creativity and your freedom within the system. I said way back in my Ace Combat X review that I would love to see this system make its way into a mainline entry, and now that I've played one with it, I can confidently say that I do in fact love the addition of it. Back to the actual gameplay though, I did say there were a couple of new additions here, and the first of these actually comes from the clouds of all things. Clouds have been present in the Ace Combat games since way back in the PS2 days, but they've never been more than just visual flair for the maps. Here, however, they've added a couple of new mechanics that force the player to take clouds into consideration while playing the game. The first of which is the fact that your plane will actually ice over if you spend too long inside of the clouds, meaning that if you do enter them, you better rush to get back out before you lose control of your plane entirely. Additionally, missiles from both you and your enemies will have weaker tracking when flying through the clouds, meaning that you need to get closer to your enemies before shooting if they decide to fly through them, and you can even go into the clouds to lose missiles if you're having trouble evading them normally. And back to when I mentioned how detailed the briefings are earlier, they even include weather reports and show you the cloud coverage in the map so that you're aware of how much you're going to have to deal with them in each given mission. They aren't completely game-changing by any means, but I feel like these added mechanics with the clouds do add a much-needed depth and minor environmental hazard to the gameplay, and I think that these are definitely some positive additions. And this next thing isn't actually a new mechanic, but it is one that I forgot to mention when I played the game it was introduced in. By pressing both your brakes and your afterburners at the same time, you'll get a much quicker burst of momentum to turn your plane with, though your overall speed will slowly decrease while using it, leaving you at a risk of stalling out if you use it all the time. These are known as high G turns, and they were actually present all the way back in Ace Combat 6, and I simply forgot to include it in the video as I didn't even discover the addition of it until late into the game, as the game doesn't include the high G turns in the tutorial at the beginning. Once again, these are a minor addition to the gameplay overall, but they add that little bit of extra depth to the game's basic controls, so I'm personally a fan, though I do think players should lose speed a little more quickly than they do to better lean into the risk-reward factor of the feature. And since we're already on the topic of features returning from previous games, flares also make a return from Assault Horizon here. I didn't find myself relying on them as often in 7 as I did in Assault Horizon, as the pace of the gameplay here is much slower than it was in that game, but there were a couple missions later into the game that were so crazy that I would suddenly find myself relying on them. You might be noticing a pattern here, but once again, a small addition that just adds a layer of extra fun to the gameplay. And thankfully, something else returns here in 7 that was completely absent from the last couple entries in the series. Those good old-fashioned Ace Combat super weapons. We get introduced to the first of them a few missions into the game when a large Erusian weapon known as the Arsenal Bird shows up after a large dogfight, sending out a small army of drones to attack us. The Arsenal Bird retreats while we deal with the drones, and we even lose a couple of squad mates to them, establishing how much of a threat this thing actually is without it even ever using its main weapons against us. Shortly after this, we get sent on a mission to escort President Harling from Ace Combat 5 out of a hotly contested area in the conflict, the International Space Elevator. While doing so, the helicopter that's flying him out suddenly gets hit by an Ocean missile, and we get accused of being the one who fired it, and were eventually found guilty of President Harling's assassination. From here, we get sent off to prison, where we end up getting assigned to Spare Squadron, a fighter squadron made up of convicts who were formerly pilots, who are sent on the most impossible missions the Ocean Air Force has due to our expendable nature. And thanks to the impossible nature of the missions that we get sent on, the mission variety here in AC7 is actually really great. There's a great mix of air-to-air, air-to-ground, and air-to-ship combat throughout the entire campaign. There are unique mission gimmicks that don't seem like they'll get annoying on repeat playthroughs, unlike AC5, and there's an amazing variety in the locations and backdrops of the mission as well. Not to mention the fact that players get to revisit various locations from the best games in the series, such as Stonehenge and Farbanti from Ace Combat 4, Anchorhead from Ace Combat 2, and even the Mass Driver from Ace Combat 5. And a very pleasant surprise to me was the return of what this game now refers to as Annihilation missions. This is the mission archetype that made up the vast majority of Ace Combat 4's campaign, where you're thrown into a large-scale battle with a strict time limit and are required to destroy enough targets within that time to meet a minimum point requirement and complete the mission. Along with this, the return line from Ace Combat 4 also returns exclusively to these missions, allowing you to go and get ammo and repairs at any time during the mission at the cost of using up a decent chunk of time in order to do so. As someone who still considers AC4 to be their favorite in the series, I was very happy to see a small handful of missions thrown in here that just replicate that game's style, and while I know there are some fans out there that hate this kind of mission, I personally loved their reintroduction here. Another gimmick that made me incredibly happy was the return of extreme weather conditions. There are a couple missions in the game where you'll have to fly through an extreme storm, or at the very least, storm clouds, and these missions are incredibly intense. There are strong winds that can throw your plane around unexpectedly, which doesn't really hinder your gameplay all that much, but it does just enough to make the player feel like they're struggling to maintain control over their plane, and that small psychological effect alone makes the strong winds incredibly fun and engaging. Along with that, when you're flying through the storm clouds, it's likely that you'll be struck by lightning if you hang around in there for too long, and this will hinder your control over your plane a lot. So not only have they brought back the extreme weather conditions from Assault Horizon, but they've actively made them more dynamic and interesting, and while I liked them in Assault Horizon, I absolutely loved them here in Ace Combat 7. And speaking of these thunderstorms, during the first one we encounter in the game, we're also introduced to Mihai, an ace pilot from Erusia who is so great that he's known as the King of the Skies. We get into an insane dogfight with him where we fight while flying through uneven terrain while in the middle of a thunderstorm, but neither of us manage to shoot the other down, with him being ordered to retreat due to the storm before our fight can reach its conclusion. From here, Mihai ends up being our rival for the rest of the game, with us running into him numerous times throughout the campaign. And just to add a little more intrigue into the mix, we see during the cutscenes that the scientist who's developing the drones for Aruja is also working alongside Mihai to record his flight patterns and data so that they can be programmed into a new model of drones, which would effectively give them an entire army of pilots who are on par with the so-called King of the Skies. But after our encounter with Mihai, as well as pulling off multiple other suicide missions assigned to us, we're eventually pardoned and recruited by the elite long-range strategic strike group of the Osean Air Force. And now that we're officially back in the Air Force, we take part in one surgical strike against the Erusian forces after another, slowly retaking the continent. But during our battle over Farbanti, Osea and Aruja both use anti-satellite weapons against one another, taking down the entire satellite network and knocking out all communications and IFF networks along with it. This leads to a fun gimmick being added in for a couple of missions where we don't know who's friend or foe, and we need to get close and get visual confirmation of each potential target before firing on them. It's something that would be incredibly annoying if it went on for too long, but since they only used it for 2 missions, it went away just as it was starting to become tedious, and I have to give Project Ace's props for coming up with an entirely new gimmick that none of the 12 games that came before this one had. But getting into the climax of the game, it's revealed that all of the drones and super weapons that Aruja has been using throughout the game have actually been developed for them by Belkan scientists because, of course, if there are weapons of mass destruction in Strange Reel, Belka is probably involved somehow. It's also revealed that they had developed some of the drones to be identical to Osean planes in order to frame the country for major crimes and acts of war, which is how we ended up getting framed for assassinating President Harling. We run into Mihai again, except this time he's flying a new revision of the XO2 Wyvern that's equipped with a mobile railgun. This leads to what is probably the craziest dogfight in the game, and it was so intense that we fought for nearly 5 minutes before I finally managed to shoot him down. From here, we go to secure the International Space Elevator, bringing us full circle back to where we were originally framed. Shortly after we arrive, the Arsenal Bird does as well, releasing its entire army of drones this time, as well as activating all of its onboard weaponry. And I have to say, this is easily one of, if not just my favorite super weapon fight in the entire franchise. The sheer amount of drones flying around, along with the insane number of missiles and lasers being shot from the Arsenal Bird itself, make it one of the most hectic battles in the series, and the track that plays in the background during the fight only makes it that much better. But once we've shot it down, we're immediately attacked by 2 Belkan drones flying superplanes who were actually programmed to mimic Mihai's flight patterns and techniques, meaning that we essentially get that Mihai fight from a couple missions prior, except now there's 2 of them. After defeating both of them, we realize that one managed to escape from its plane after getting shot down and is flying into the core of the space elevator in order to upload the Mihai data to other drone factories across the continent, which leads us into one of the best tunnel runs the franchise has ever seen for the finale. We destroy the drone beneath the space elevator, and to make our final escape, we fly back up and out of the elevator itself in what is one of the most surprisingly claustrophobic set pieces the series has to offer, and then it's all finally over. Overall, I enjoyed Ace Combat 7 far more than I had expected to. It feels like classic Ace Combat in all the best ways, while still injecting its own unique flavor into the formula, and it's easily the most fun I've had with an Ace Combat game since I played Ace Combat 4 all those months ago. The story might not be the best the series has to offer, but I would say that it's better than most of the games, and thankfully, the quality of the core gameplay and the campaign more than makes up for any issues I might have had with it. It really feels like a celebration of the return of Ace Combat, and to me, it's a textbook example of how developers should approach reviving dormant franchises, simply taking what worked so well when the series was in its prime and making small additions that don't intrude on that core experience. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown an 8.7. And that's it, you guys. We've played and reviewed every game in the Ace Combat franchise. It was a long few months of work, but it was a very worthwhile journey to go on, and I hope that you guys enjoyed watching the series as much as I enjoyed producing it. You guys really made this series possible, since without all of you, I'm just a guy sitting here talking to himself. From here, I'll be moving on to closing out the last of the Metal Gear games, and then moving on to a new series from there. I'd love to see you guys around the channel wherever we go next, but if not, thank you again for even spending this much time watching. And just know that whenever that rumored Ace Combat 8 comes around, I'll be looking forward to covering it, and you can absolutely expect me to make a video. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already to keep up to date with whatever we do next, and stop by my Patreon page if you want to support an incredibly handsome guy and his weird obsession with deep dives into how gaming franchises have evolved over time. Thanks again, guys, and I'll hope to see you all again soon.